In the heart of Ohio's Amish country, 42-year-old Ruth Yoder faces the unthinkable, losing everything she's worked for after her husband's sudden death leaves her drowning in medical debts. Cast out by her own community for challenging traditional ways, Ruth must swallow her pride and seek work at Hillcrest Vineyard, owned by the English world she was taught to fear. What begins as a desperate attempt to save her farm becomes a journey of self-discovery, unexpected friendship, and a shocking revelation that will change not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Sometimes the most beautiful grapes grow from the most broken vines. The envelope trembled in Ruth Yoder's weathered hands as she stared at the bold red letters stamped across the white paper, "Final Notice." Her calloused fingers, stained from years of tending to chickens and milking cows, traced the harsh words that seemed to burn through the thin paper and into her very soul. 30 days, she whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice barely audible above the tick of the old wooden clock on the wall. 30 days to pay $23,000, or they take the farm. The morning light streamed through the simple white curtains, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table where she sat. This table had been in her family for 3 generations. Her grandmother had kneaded bread on this very surface. Her mother had served countless meals here. And now Ruth sat alone, facing the possibility of losing it all. 6 months. That's how long it had been since Jacob's heart gave out in the middle of their cornfield. One moment he was walking between the rows, checking the crop like he had done every summer morning for 22 years of marriage. The next moment, Ruth was running barefoot across the rough earth, her prayer cap flying off her head as she screamed his name to the indifferent sky. The medical bills had started arriving 2 weeks after the funeral. Apparently, the 3 days Jacob spent in the English hospital's intensive care unit before passing had cost more than their farm made in 2 years. The insurance the Amish community provided covered burial costs and some basic medical needs, but not the advanced life support equipment and specialists that had fought to save her husband's life. Ruth pushed back from the table, her simple black dress rustling against the wooden chair. At 42, she felt ancient. The lines around her blue eyes had deepened in the months since Jacob's death, and her once golden hair, now streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in the traditional bun beneath her black mourning cap. She walked to the window and gazed out at the 40-acre farm that had been her whole world. The red barn needed painting, and 2 fence posts had rotted through last winter, but it was home. The vegetable garden she'd tended for over 2 decades stretched out behind the house, heavy with late summer tomatoes and squash. Her dozen chickens pecked contentedly in their pen, unaware that their peaceful world was about to crumble. "What am I supposed to do, Jacob?" she asked the empty air, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. "You always handled the money. You always knew what to do." The sound of buggy wheels on gravel made her turn. Through the window she watched as Bishop Samuel Mast's black buggy pulled into her lane. Her stomach dropped. Official visits from the bishop were never good news, especially for a widow who had already caused whispers in the community. Ruth smoothed her apron and walked to the front door, steeling herself for whatever judgment was coming. Bishop Mast was a tall, stern man with a beard that reached nearly to his chest. He'd led their district for 15 years with an iron fist wrapped in scripture. "Bishop," Ruth said quietly, bowing her head as she opened the door. "Please, come in." He removed his wide-brimmed black hat as he entered, his grey eyes scanning the simple interior of her home. Everything was neat and plain, exactly as it should be according to the ordnan, the unwritten rules that governed their Amish life. "Ruth Yoder," he said in his deep, measured voice. "We need to talk." She gestured toward the kitchen table, the final notice still lying there like an accusation. Bishop Mast's eyes fell on it immediately, and his expression hardened. "The community has been talking," he began, settling his large frame into Jacob's old chair. The sight of someone else sitting in her husband's place made Ruth's chest tighten. "About your situation." "My situation?" Ruth asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "Your debts," he said bluntly. and your response to them. 3 weeks ago, Ruth had done the unthinkable. She had approached the church elders, asking if the community could help with the medical bills. Not a loan, not charity exactly, but the kind of mutual aid that had sustained their people for generations. The request had been met with uncomfortable silence and sideways glances. The community has already done its duty, Bishop Mast continued. We provided for Jacob's burial. We brought food during your mourning period. The mutual aid fund has its limits, Ruth. These debts you speak of, they come from the English world and their English ways. Had Jacob stayed in God's will and avoided their hospitals, these debts would not exist. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. Jacob was dying, Bishop. The English doctors tried to save his life. Was I supposed to let him die? That was God's will, Bishop Mast replied sternly. We do not question God's will, Ruth. We accept it with grace. And what about my children? The words burst from her before she could stop them. Sarah is only 16. Aaron is 13. Are they supposed to lose their home because I chose to fight for their father's life? The bishop's expression softened slightly at the mention of her children, but his resolve remained firm. Your children will be cared for. The Beachy family has agreed to take them in if necessary. Young Aaron could learn a good trade from Samuel Beachy, and Sarah, well, she's of an age to be thinking of marriage soon anyway. Split up my family. Ruth's voice rose dangerous. Bishop, this farm has been in Jacob's family for 3 generations. My children were born in the bedroom upstairs. This is their home. Ruth, Bishop Mast's voice carried a warning. Pride is a sin. Your attachment to worldly possessions is concerning the elders. Perhaps losing this farm is God's way of teaching you humility. Ruth stared at him, feeling something crack inside her chest. These were the people she had worshipped alongside her entire life. She had followed every rule, attended every service, participated in every barn raising and quilting bee. She had been a perfect Amish wife and mother, and now they were willing to see her family destroyed rather than help with debts incurred trying to save her husband's life. I see, she said quietly. There is another matter, Bishop Mast continued, apparently not hearing the dangerous calm in her voice. Your behavior since Jacob's death has caused concern. You've been seen in town more frequently than is proper for a woman in mourning. You've been asking questions about employment opportunities. It was true. Desperate and running out of options, Ruth had started inquiring about work, but jobs for Amish women were limited, especially widows with no husband to approve their activity. The few positions available, cleaning houses or working in the small shops, catering to tourists, paid barely enough to feed a family, let alone tackle a debt that would take decades to repay. I need to provide for my children, Bishop. That is not your role, Ruth. Your role is to grieve properly, to maintain your faith, and to trust in God's plan. If God intends for you to keep this farm, He will provide a way. If He doesn't, the bishop shrugged, then His will be done. Ruth felt 22 years of obedience and submission burning away like morning mist. She stood slowly, her hands pressed flat against the table. Bishop, with all due respect, God also gave me a mind and 2 hands. Perhaps His will is for me to use them to save my family. The bishop's eyes narrowed. Ruth Yoder, you are walking dangerously close to the edge of our community's patience. Your questioning of God's will, your prideful attachment to worldly things, your desire to work like a man, these are not the actions of a faithful Amish woman. And what would you have me do? Sit here and wait for God to rain down money from heaven while my children lose their home? I would have you trust in God's plan and accept the help of your community in the proper way. Allow the Beachy family to take your children. Find yourself a modest room in town. Accept that this trial is meant to teach you humility and faith. Ruth looked around the kitchen where she had spent over half her life. At the scarred wooden counters where she had taught Sarah to knead bread. At the corner where Aaron had taken his first steps. At the chair where Jacob had read his Bible every morning before heading out to the fields. No, she said quietly. Bishop Mast's eyebrows rose. I beg your pardon. No. Ruth repeated, louder this time. I will not give up my children. I will not give up my home. I will not sit quietly and let my family be destroyed while the community watches and calls it God's will. The bishop stood slowly, his face darkening. Ruth Yoder, you are choosing pride over faith. You are choosing the world over God. I came here today hoping to find a repentant woman, ready to accept God's will. Instead, I find a rebellious widow who has forgotten her place. My place, Ruth's voice rose. My place is protecting my children and honoring my husband's memory by keeping the farm he worked his whole life to build. Your husband is dead, Ruth. Your duty now is to submit to God's will and the wisdom of your community leaders. If this is God's will, then God and I have a fundamental disagreement about justice. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Bishop Mast's face went pale, and he took a step backward. Ruth Yoder, he said in a voice that seemed to echo with the authority of centuries, you are hereby warned that your behavior and attitude are leading you toward shunning. Continue down this path, and you will find yourself cut off from the only community you have ever known. He placed his hat back on his head and walked toward the door, then paused. You have 1 month to come to your senses, 1 month to repent of this pride and submit to God's will. After that, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. After the bishop left, Ruth stood in her kitchen, shaking. Shunning was the ultimate punishment in the Amish community. Complete social isolation from everyone she had ever known. No one would speak to her, trade with her, or acknowledge her existence. Her own children would be pressured to turn their backs on her. But as she looked at the final notice still lying on the table, Ruth realized she was already facing isolation. The community she had served faithfully for over 4 decades was willing to watch her family be destroyed, rather than help with debts incurred, trying to save her husband's life. She walked to the window again and stared out at the vast landscape of rolling hills and farmland. In the distance, she could see something that had never been there when she was a child. Row upon row of grapevines stretching across what had once been corn and soybean fields. Hillcrest Vineyard, owned by an English family named Morris. Ruth had heard whispers about the vineyard over the years, mostly disapproving comments about how the English were changing the character of their farming community. But she had also heard something else. They paid fair wages to their workers, especially during harvest season. As she watched, a pickup truck wound its way through the vineyard roads, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to work among those vines. What it would be like to earn her own money, to save her farm through the work of her own hands, rather than the charity of others. The clock on the wall chimed noon, and Ruth made a decision that would change her life forever. She untied her apron, smoothed her hair beneath her cap, and walked to the small closet where she kept her one good shawl. Ruth turned to see her daughter Sarah standing in the doorway, her 16-year-old face creased with worry. Sarah had her father's dark hair and serious eyes, but she had inherited Ruth's stubborn chin. "Where are you going, Mama? I saw Bishop Mast leave, and you look different." Ruth studied her daughter's face, seeing the fear and uncertainty there. Sarah had grown up so much in the 6 months since her father's death, taking on household responsibilities without complaint, caring for her younger brother Aaron when Ruth was lost in grief. "I'm going to save our home, Sarah," Ruth said simply. "How, Mama? The church won't help with the debt, and there's no work that pays enough to—" "There might be," Ruth interrupted gently, "but it will require me to step outside our community in ways that might make people angry." Sarah's eyes widened. "You mean working for the English?" "I mean doing whatever it takes to keep our family together and our home in our hands." For a long moment, mother and daughter stared at each other across the simple kitchen. Finally, Sarah nodded. "Then I'll help," she said quietly. "Whatever you need to do, Mama, I'll help." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "It might mean people in our community won't speak to us anymore, Sarah. It might mean losing everything we've ever known about how to live." "We already lost that," Sarah replied. her young voice steady and determined. "We can't lose each other too. And this farm, it's all we have left of him. If working for the English is what it takes to keep it, then that's what we do." Ruth crossed the kitchen and pulled her daughter into her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling the strength in her slim frame. "I love you, my brave girl," she whispered. "I love you too, Mama. Now go. Go save our home." Ruth picked up her shawl and walked toward the door, her heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure. As she stepped outside into the warm Ohio afternoon, she felt as though she was crossing more than just her threshold. She was crossing into a completely different world. The walk to Hillcrest Vineyard would take her about 30 minutes on foot. 30 minutes to prepare herself for a conversation that would either save her family or destroy everything she had ever believed about herself. As she started down the dusty lane that led away from the only life she had ever known, Ruth Yoder had no idea that her desperate decision to seek work among the English vines would lead to discoveries that would shock not just her, but everyone whose life she was about to touch. Behind her, the farm sat silent in the afternoon sun, waiting to see if its mistress would find a way to save it. And ahead of her, the vineyard sprawled across the rolling hills like a green promise, holding secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about family, faith, and the complicated paths that lead us home. The gravel crunched beneath Ruth's worn black shoes as she approached the entrance to Hillcrest Vineyard. A wooden sign, weathered but well-maintained, bore the name in elegant script alongside a painting of purple grapes hanging heavy on the vine. Below it, a smaller sign read, "Morrison Family Vineyard, Est. Night." Ruth paused at the edge of the property, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never been this close to the vineyard before, having only glimpsed it from a distance during her rare trips to town. Now, standing at its entrance, she was struck by how different everything looked from her simple Amish world. The main building was a sprawling structure of weathered wood and stone that seemed to grow naturally from the hills. Large windows reflected the afternoon sun, and she could see people moving inside what appeared to be some kind of tasting room. To her left, rows upon rows of grapevines stretched across the rolling hills, their leaves a rich green in the late summer sun. "Can I help you?" Ruth jumped at the voice, spinning around to see a woman in her 50s walking toward her. She was tall and elegant, wearing dark jeans and a cream-colored blouse that probably cost more than Ruth spent on clothes in a year. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and her brown eyes were kind but curious as they took in Ruth's traditional black dress and prayer cap. I'm sorry," Ruth stammered, suddenly feeling foolish. "I was looking for, that is, I heard you might be hiring workers." The woman's expression softened. "You're Amish," she said, not as a question but as an observation. "Are you Ruth Yoder?" Ruth's eyes widened in surprise. "You know who I am? Small community," the woman replied with a gentle smile. "I'm Margaret Morris. My husband David and I own this vineyard. I heard about your husband's passing. I'm very sorry for your loss." The unexpected kindness in the stranger's voice nearly undid Ruth. She had grown so accustomed to judgment and disapproval from her own community that simple compassion from an English woman caught her completely off guard. "Thank you," Ruth managed, blinking back tears. That's very kind of you to say." Margaret studied Ruth's face for a moment, seeming to read the desperation and determination there. "Why don't you come inside? We can talk more comfortably in my office." Ruth hesitated. Once she stepped inside that building, there would be no turning back. Bishop Mast's warning echoed in her mind, but then she thought of Sarah's brave face and the final notice lying on her kitchen table. "Yes," she said quietly. "I would like that." Margaret led her up a stone walkway lined with lavender plants that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. The main building was even more impressive, up close, with large wooden doors that opened into a spacious tasting room. Ruth tried not to gawk at the polished wood floors, the stone fireplace, and the elegant bar where several couples were sampling wine from small glasses. "This way," Margaret said, guiding Ruth through the tasting room and down a hallway lined with photographs of the vineyard through different seasons. Ruth found herself slowing to look at one picture that showed the same hills she could see from her farm. but covered entirely in snow with the bare grapevines, looking like delicate black lace against the white landscape. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Margaret said, noticing her interest. "That was taken 3 winters ago. There's something magical about the vineyard in winter. So quiet and peaceful, like it's sleeping until spring." Margaret's office was comfortable and unpretentious, with a large desk covered in papers and 2 mismatched chairs facing each other near a window that overlooked the vines. She gestured for Ruth to sit, then settled into the other chair rather than behind her desk, creating a sense of equality that Ruth had never experienced with authority figures. "So," Margaret said gently, "tell me what brings you here today." Ruth looked down at her hands folded in her lap, gathering her courage. "My husband left debts when he died. Medical bills from the hospital. I need work to pay them or I'll lose our farm." "How much do you owe?" Margaret asked direct. Ruth was startled by the bluntness of the question, but also relieved not to have to dance around the issue. $23,000. The bank has given me 30 days. Margaret whistled softly. "That's a substantial amount. What kind of work experience do you have?" "I've run a farm household my entire adult life," Ruth said, her voice growing stronger as she talked about familiar territory. "I can cook for large groups, preserve food, manage livestock, tend gardens, do bookkeeping, organize workers during harvest time. I'm strong, I work hard, and I learn quickly." "Have you ever worked outside your community before?" "No," Ruth admitted, "but I'm willing to do whatever needs to be done." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying Ruth's face. Finally, she leaned forward in her chairs. "Ruth, I'm going to be honest with you. Harvest season is starting in 2 weeks, and we're short-handed this year. 2 of our regular seasonal workers moved away, and we haven't been able to replace them. The work is hard. Long days in the sun, lots of bending and lifting, and the hours can be unpredictable depending on weather conditions." Ruth felt a flutter of hope. "What would the pay be?" $18 an hour during harvest season, which typically runs 6 to 8 weeks. "If you proved reliable, there might be other work afterward, helping with winter preparation, pruning, general maintenance. But I have to ask, how does your community feel about you working here?" Ruth's stomach tightened. They don't approve. Will that be a problem for you?" Ruth thought of Bishop Mast's stern face, of the disapproving whispers that had followed her through the grocery store, of the friends who no longer met her eyes in church. "It might be a problem for them," she said finally, "but it won't be a problem for me doing the work." Margaret nodded slowly. "There's something else you should know. My husband David can be brusque. He's a good man, but he doesn't always have the most patience with new workers. He'll expect you to pull your own weight from day one." "I understand. And the other workers, they're mostly young men from town, plus a few migrant families who come for harvest season. You'd be the only Amish worker we've ever had, and probably the oldest woman. Are you prepared for that?" Ruth thought of all the times she had been the only woman in male-dominated situations, helping with barn raisings, participating in discussions about crop rotations, negotiating with feed suppliers when Jacob was too sick to handle business. "I can handle it," she said with quiet confidence. Margaret smiled. "I believe you can. All right, Ruth Yoder, let's see if this arrangement can work for both of us. Can you start Monday morning? We'll begin at 7 a.m. Is that too early?" "I've been getting up at 5 a.m. to milk cows for 22 years, Ruth said, allowing herself a small smile. 7 a.m. sounds luxurious. Perfect. The work clothing you'll need is sturdy pants. Jeans are fine. Closed-toe shoes with good traction. A long-sleeved shirt to protect your arms from the vines, and a wide-brimmed hat. Do you have access to those things?" Ruth mentally inventoried her wardrobe. She had never owned a pair of jeans in her life, and most of her clothes were dresses or skirts. "I may need to make some purchases. There's a farm supply store in town that should have everything you need. Tell them you're working at Morrison Vineyard. They'll know what type of work boots are best for vineyard work." Margaret stood and extended her hand. Ruth rose and shook it, struck by the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of someone who did physical work herself. "One more thing," Margaret said. We provide lunch for all our workers during harvest season. Nothing fancy, usually sandwiches and fruit, but it's included, and there's always cold water and sports drinks available throughout the day. As they walked back through the tasting room, Ruth felt as though she were moving through a dream. Less than an hour ago, she had been facing the complete destruction of her family's life. Now she had a job that, if she worked the full harvest season, might actually provide enough money to make a significant dent in their debt. "Ruth," Margaret said, as they reached the front door, "can I ask you something personal?" Ruth nodded. "What made you decide to come here today? I know this can't have been an easy choice for someone from your community." Ruth looked out across the vineyard, watching workers moving between the rows of vines in the distance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hills, and she could hear the distant sound of laughter from the tasting room behind them. "My daughter," she said simply, "she told me to go save our home, and my husband, he always said that God gave us hands and minds for a reason. Maybe this is the reason." Margaret squeezed her arm gently. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Ruth whispered. "I just hope I can be half as wise as he was." As Ruth walked back down the gravel drive, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, real, concrete hope, based on her own actions rather than the charity of others. The work would be hard, and the consequences within her community might be severe, but for the first time since Jacob's death, she felt like she had some control over her family's fate. The walk home passed quickly, her mind busy with plans. She would need to go to town tomorrow to buy work clothes. She would have to arrange for Sarah and Aaron to manage the morning chores while she was at the vineyard. And somehow she would have to find the courage to face the disapproval and possible shunning that would inevitably come. But as she crested the hill that brought her farm into view, Ruth felt her steps grow lighter. The red barn still needed painting, and the fence posts still sagged, but the late afternoon light made everything look golden and hopeful. This was her home, her children's inheritance, the physical representation of everything Jacob had worked for. And now, thanks to a kind English woman and a vineyard full of grapes, she had a fighting chance to keep it. "Mama!" Sarah's voice called from the porch, and Ruth looked up to see her daughter running toward her, Aaron close behind. "How did it go? Did you find work?" Ruth caught both her children in her arms, hugging them tight against her chest. "I found work," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Hard work, but good work. We're going to save our home." Aaron, who had been unusually quiet since his father's death, looked up at her with eyes that were too old for his 13 years. "Will the church be angry?" Ruth smoothed his dark hair. "So like his father's." "Probably, but sometimes, Aaron, doing what's right for your family means making choices that other people don't understand." "Will we still be Amish?" Sarah asked quietly. It was a question Ruth had been afraid to ask herself. The Amish weren't just a religion, they were a complete way of life, a community and identity that reached back through centuries. By choosing to work outside that community, by defying the bishop's authority, she was risking not just social isolation, but the very foundation of everything she had ever known about herself. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we'll still be family, and we'll still be the people Dad raised us to be, strong, hard-working, and faithful to what we know is right." That evening, as Ruth sat at her kitchen table, making a list of the work clothes she would need to buy, she felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. Tomorrow she would drive to town, something she had done perhaps a dozen times since Jacob's death. She would enter stores she had never been in, buy clothes she had never worn, and begin preparing for work unlike anything she had ever done. But tonight, as the sun set over the farm that had been her whole world, Ruth Yoder allowed herself to believe that she might actually be strong enough to save it. The grapes at Morrison Vineyard were almost ready for harvest, and so perhaps was she. Outside, the evening sounds of the farm settled around her like a familiar blanket, the soft lowing of their 2 cows, the rustle of chickens settling on their roosts, the whisper of wind through the corn that Jacob had planted in what would be his final spring. It was the same symphony she had listened to for over 20 years, But tonight it sounded different. Tonight it sounded like possibility. Ruth stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom at 5:30 Monday morning, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. The stiff new jeans felt foreign against her legs, and the long-sleeved cotton work shirt seemed impossibly casual after a lifetime of modest dresses. She had braided her hair and pinned it securely under a wide-brimmed straw hat she'd found at the farm supply store. But without her prayer cap, she felt exposed and somehow incomplete. "You look different," Sarah said softly from the doorway, holding a lunch pail she had packed for her mother. "But strong, like you're ready for whatever comes." Ruth turned to face her daughter, seeing her own nervousness reflected in Sarah's blue eyes. "I feel like I'm putting on a costume to play a part I don't know how to perform." "It always said that courage isn't remote being scared," Sarah replied, using the Pennsylvania Dutch word for father that they still used at home. "It's doing what needs to be done even when you are scared." Ruth took the lunch pail, surprised by its weight. "What did you pack in here?" "Enough food for 2 people, Sarah admitted. "I wasn't sure how much work like this would make you hungry, so I made extra sandwiches and added some of the cookies we baked yesterday." "Sarah, you don't need to take care of me like this." "Yes, I do," her daughter said firmly. "We're a family. We take care of each other. That's what Dad taught us." Ruth pulled Sarah into a fierce hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and drawing strength from her daughter's unwavering support. "I love you, my brave girl. I love you too, Mum. Now go show those English people what an Amish woman can do." The walk to the vineyard in the pre-dawn darkness was both longer and shorter than Ruth had expected. Longer because every step took her further from the life she had always known, but shorter because all too soon she was standing at the employee entrance. Margaret had shown her, watching other workers arrive in pickup trucks and beat-up cars. Ruth had never felt more conspicuous in her life. The other workers were mostly young men in their 20s and 30s, with a few older Hispanic men who nodded politely but spoke in rapid Spanish among themselves. She was clearly the only woman, and definitely the only person who had arrived on foot. "You must be Ruth," a gruff voice said behind her, and she turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and permanent tan lines around his eyes. This had to be David Morrison, Margaret's husband. "I'm David. Welcome to the vineyard." His handshake was firm but brief, and his brown eyes assessed her with the practical gaze of someone sizing up a new piece of equipment. "Margaret says you've never done vineyard work before." "No, sir," Ruth replied, "but I'm willing to learn." "We'll see," he said curtly, then raised his voice to address the gathering workers. "All right, everyone, we're starting harvest on the north slope today. The Riesling grapes are perfectly ripe, and we need to get them picked before the weather changes. Danny will assign rows and explain the process to anyone who's new." A young man in his late 20s stepped forward, wearing jeans so faded they were nearly white, and a baseball cap advertising a local feed store. "Danny Kowalski," he said, extending his hand to Ruth. "I'm the crew foreman. You're the Amish lady Margaret told me about." "Ruth Yoder," she replied, shaking his hand and noting the genuine friendliness in his green eyes. "Never worked with Amish before," Danny said, conversationally as he led the group toward a large shed filled with equipment. "But I've heard you folks know how to work. That true?" "I suppose we'll find out," Ruth said, earning a grin from the young foreman. The equipment shed was a revelation. Ruth watched as Danny distributed plastic picking buckets, pruning shears, and what looked like small knives. The other workers moved with the easy familiarity of people who had done this many times before, but Ruth hung back, feeling lost. "First time?" asked a voice beside her, and Ruth turned to see one of the Hispanic workers, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and calloused hands. "I'm Carlos Mendez, been coming here for harvest for 6 years, Ruth Yoder. And yes, it's my first time doing anything like this." "Don't worry," Carlos said in accented but clear English. "I show you. The work is hard but not complicated. You look strong. You'll do fine." Danny clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, people, Basic harvest rules: we're picking by hand, looking for perfect clusters. Leave anything that's damaged, underripe or showing signs of rot. Cut the stems clean, don't pull or twist. Fill your buckets about 3/4 full. Any fuller and you'll damage the grapes on the bottom. Questions? Ruth raised her hand tentatively. How will I know which grapes are ready? Good question. Come here. Danny led her to a sample vine loaded with clusters of pale green grapes. See how these look almost translucent? And feel this. He handed her a grape to taste. Ruth bit into it, expecting the sharp tartness of unripe fruit, but instead tasted something complex and sweet, with just a hint of acidity. Oh, she said in surprise. That's actually delicious. That's how you know they're ready, Danny explained. Trust your taste buds. If it tastes good to you, it'll make good wine. The group moved out to the vineyard as the sun was just beginning to rise over the eastern hills. Ruth found herself assigned to a row between Carlos and a young man named Jake, who couldn't have been more than 22. The vines stretched ahead of her in what seemed like an endless line, heavy with clusters of grapes that caught the early morning light like pale jewels. Start at this end, Carlos instructed, showing her how to hold the pruning shears and where to cut each cluster. Work steady but don't rush. Better to do it right than fast. Ruth bent to her first cluster, examining it carefully before making her cut. The grape stem was tougher than she had expected, requiring more force with the shears than she had anticipated. Her first few attempts were clumsy, but gradually she developed a rhythm. Cut, examine, cut, place gently and bucket. The work was meditative in a way that reminded her of other familiar tasks. Shelling peas, husking corn, gathering eggs. There was something deeply satisfying about the repetitive motion, the steady progress down the row, the growing weight of the bucket at her feet. But the physical demands were unlike anything she had experienced. Within an hour, her back was aching from the constant bending. Her hands, despite the work gloves Danny had provided, were developing blisters from gripping the shears. The sun, climbing higher in the sky, was beating down on her shoulders despite her long-sleeved shirt. You okay? Jake asked during their first water break, noting Ruth's flushed face and the way she was stretching her back. Getting used to it, Ruth replied, accepting a cup of cold water gratefully. It gets easier, Jake assured her. I thought I was gonna die my first day last year. Now look. He gestured to his row, where he had already picked twice as many clusters as Ruth. Jake's right, Carlos added, joining their conversation. The body learns. By the end of the week, you'll feel stronger. As the morning wore on, Ruth began to understand what Carlos meant. Her movements became more efficient, her cuts cleaner. She learned to position her body to reduce strain on her back, to move the bucket more frequently so she wasn't reaching so far, to pace herself for the long haul rather than trying to keep up with the younger workers. More importantly, she began to appreciate the beauty of what she was doing. Each vine was different, with its own personality and challenges. Some hung heavy with perfect clusters that practically fell into her hands. Others required careful selection, with good grapes nestled beside damaged ones that needed to be left behind. You're getting the hang of it, Danny said, appearing beside her row around mid-morning. Nice, clean cuts. Good selection. How are you feeling? Tired, Ruth admitted. But good tired, if that makes sense. Makes perfect sense. That's honest work. Tired, different from worry, tired, or grief tired. Ruth looked at him, in surprise. It was the first time anyone at the vineyard had acknowledged her recent loss, and the casual kindness in his voice caught her off guard. Margaret told me about your husband, Danny explained. Sorry for your loss. Can't be easy starting over like this. Thank you, Ruth said quietly. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But you're doing it, Danny pointed out. That counts for something. At noon, Margaret appeared with a pickup truck loaded with sandwiches, fruit and cold drinks. The workers gathered in whatever shade they could find, and Ruth found herself sitting on the tailgate of the truck between Carlos and an older man named Frank, who had introduced himself as a retiree working harvest for the fun of it. "So what's your story?" Frank asked as he unwrapped a ham sandwich. Margaret said, "You're Amish, but I got to admit, I don't know much about Amish folks, except you make good furniture and don't drive cars." Ruth hesitated, not sure how much to share with these strangers, but something about the genuine curiosity in Frank's weathered face and the accepting atmosphere among the workers made her want to try. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said simply. "Left medical bills I can't pay. I need to work to save our farm." "Medical bill?" Carlos shook his head sympathetically. "That's rough. My wife, she had surgery 2 years ago. Even with insurance, we're still paying." "Your church doesn't help with stuff like that?" Jake asked. Ruth felt her cheeks burn. They think I should sell the farm and let other families take in my children. They think the debt is God's way of teaching me humility." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, and Ruth immediately regretted sharing so much. These English people couldn't possibly understand the complexities of Amish community life, the careful balance of mutual aid and submission to authority that governed every aspect of "That's bullshit," Frank said bluntly, causing Ruth to look up in shock. "Pardon my language, but that's just plain wrong. You work your whole life, pay your dues, follow the rules, and when trouble comes they tell you to give up everything. That ain't God talking. That's just mean people hiding behind God." "Frank's right," Danny said, having overheard the conversation as he distributed cold sports drinks. "I don't know much about religion, but I know right from wrong. Taking care of your kids and keeping your home, that seems pretty right to me." Ruth felt tears prick her eye. These strangers, these English people she had been taught to view as worldly and potentially corrupting, were showing her more understanding and support than her own community had offered. "Thank you," she said quietly. That means more than you know. "We look out for each other here," Carlos said simply. "That's how it should be." The afternoon sun was brutal, and Ruth could feel her energy flagging as her row seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of her. Her blisters had broken despite the gloves, making every grip of the shears painful. Her back was a constant ache, and she was beginning to worry that she had overestimated her ability to handle this kind of physical labor. "Ruth." Margaret's voice made her look up from the cluster she was examining. The vineyard owner was walking down her row, carrying a spray bottle filled with water. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," Ruth said, though she was sure her exhaustion was written all over her face. "Here," Margaret said, spraying the water on Ruth's face and neck. The cool mist was instantly refreshing. "Danny says you're doing great work for your first day. Clean cuts, good selection. That's not easy to learn." "It's harder than I expected," Ruth admitted, "but not in a bad way. There's something peaceful about it once you find your rhythm." Margaret smiled. "That's exactly what David said when we first started this vineyard. He'd spent 20 years as an engineer, always stressed, always dealing with deadlines and office politics. But put him out here with the vines, and he becomes a different person." As if summoned by his wife's words, David Morrison appeared at the end of Ruth's row. He walked slowly down the line, examining her work with the critical eye Ruth had learned to expect from him. "Not bad," he said finally, which Ruth was beginning to understand was high praise from David. "Your clusters are clean, stems are cut properly. You're working steady without rushing. That's good vineyard work." "Thank you, sir." David studied her face, noting the exhaustion and determination there. "This isn't easy work for someone who's never done it before, especially someone your age." Ruth bristled slightly at the comment about her age, but David wasn't finished. "But you're sticking with it, and that counts for a lot. I've had plenty of young workers who quit before lunch on their first day. The fact that you're still here, still working, still maintaining quality, that tells me something about your character." It was the longest speech Ruth had heard from the taciturn vineyard owner, and the unexpected praise made her chest tight with emotion. "I can't afford to quit," she said simply. No, David agreed. But plenty of people in your situation would have found an excuse by now. You haven't. That's worth something. As the day finally wound toward its end, Ruth felt as though she had been put through a physical and emotional marathon. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache. Her hands were raw despite the gloves, and she was so tired she could barely think straight. But as she looked back at her completed row, seeing the neat piles of grape buckets that represented her first day's work, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Pride. Not the sinful pride that Bishop Mast had warned her against, but the deep satisfaction of honest work, honestly done. Good first day, Carlos said, appearing beside her as they walked back toward the equipment shed. Tomorrow will be easier, will it? Ruth asked, genuinely curious. Your body will remember what it learned today, he said wisely, and your mind will be more confident. Trust me, by the end of the week, you'll feel like you've been doing this for years. As Ruth walked home in the gathering dusk, her lunch pail now empty and her work clothes dusty and stained, she reflected on the day's revelations. The work had been harder than anything she had ever done, but also more satisfying than she had expected. The people, these English strangers, had been kinder and more accepting than her own community. Most surprisingly, she had discovered something about herself. She was stronger than she had known. Not just physically, though her body had risen to meet the challenge, but mentally and emotionally as well. For the first time since Jacob's death, she felt like she was actively shaping her family's destiny, rather than simply enduring whatever fate had in store for them. The farm came into view as she crested the final hill, and Ruth could see Sarah waiting on the porch, just as she had waited for Jacob to come home from the fields so many evenings. The sight made her eyes fill with tears, but they were good tears, tears of gratitude and hope rather than grief and despair. "Mama," Sarah called, running to meet her. "How was it? Are you okay? You look so tired." Ruth caught her daughter in her arms, holding her close despite her dusty clothes. "I'm fine, sweet girl. Tired, but fine. And I think we're going to be okay." "Really?" Sarah asked, studying her mother's face in the fading light. "Really?" Ruth said, and for the first time in months, she truly believed it. "It's going to be hard work, but I can do it. We can do this." As they walked toward the house together, Ruth felt the weight of the day settling into her bones. Tomorrow would bring another early morning, another long day in the vineyard, another step away from the life she had always known. But tonight, as she looked forward to a hot bath and Sarah's home cooking, Ruth Yoder felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt proud of herself. On a Thursday morning of her first week at the vineyard, Ruth had developed a routine that felt almost natural. Up at 5, quick breakfast, check on the livestock, then the 30-minute walk to Hillcrest, as the sun painted the Ohio hills in shades of gold and amber. Her body had adapted more quickly than she had expected. The constant ache in her back had settled into a manageable soreness, and her hands had developed protective calluses over the broken blisters. More importantly, she was finding genuine satisfaction in the work. There was something deeply peaceful about moving through the vine rows in the early morning quiet, the only sounds the soft snip of pruning shears and the gentle plop of grapes dropping into buckets. It reminded her of the meditative quality of her morning milking routine, but with the added satisfaction of earning money that would save her farm. "Morning, Ruth," Carlos called as she approached her assigned section. Over the past few days, he had become something of a mentor, offering tips on technique and sharing stories of his own family's struggles. "Ready for another day?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Ruth replied, accepting the work gloves he handed her. The crew had started looking out for each other in small ways, sharing extra gloves, offering water, helping slower workers catch up when they fell behind. It was a camaraderie Ruth had never experienced outside her own family. "Danny says we might finish the North Slope today," Jake added, appearing with his characteristic grin. At 22, he had the endless energy of youth, but also a surprisingly mature work ethic. Then we moved to the Pinot Noir section. "Is that harder?" Ruth asked, still learning the differences between grape varieties. Different work, Carlos explained. Pinot Noir grapes are more delicate, harder to judge when they're perfect. But the vines are younger, so you don't have to bend as much. As they began their daily rhythm, Ruth found herself humming softly, something she hadn't done since Jacob's death. The melody was an old hymn her mother had sung while doing household chores, and it seemed to fit perfectly with the steady pace of harvest work. "Pretty song," Margaret said, appearing beside Ruth's row with her usual morning check-in. "I don't recognize it." "It's a hymn," Ruth explained, feeling slightly embarrassed. "My mother used to sing it while she worked. I didn't realize I was humming out loud. Don't stop on my account." "There's something lovely about music in the vineyard. David always said the grapes grow better when they're sung to." Ruth smiled at the whimsical notion, then noticed Margaret's expression was more serious than usual. "Is everything all right?" Margaret hesitated, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Ruth, I need to tell you something. Yesterday I had a visitor at the house, an older man with a long beard, driving a black buggy." Ruth's stomach dropped. He didn't give me his name, but he made it very clear he disapproved of our employing you. He suggested it would be better for everyone if we let you go." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. She had been dreading this moment, knowing it would come but hoping to have more time to prove herself indispensable. "What did you tell him?" she asked, quietly. "I told him that your employment was between you and us, and that we were very satisfied with your work." Margaret's voice carried a hint of steel that Ruth had never heard before. He didn't seem pleased with that response. "I'm sorry," Ruth said, setting down her pruning shears. "I should have warned you this might happen. If my working here is going to cause problems for your business—" "Ruth, stop!" Margaret placed a firm hand on her arm. "You're not responsible for other people's prejudices. You're doing excellent work, you're reliable, and you're part of this crew now. That man has no authority over my vineyard or my hiring decisions." Ruth felt tears threaten, overwhelmed by the fierce loyalty in Margaret's voice. "You don't understand. In my community, the bishop's word is final. If he's decided I'm to be shunned, then your community is making a mistake," Margaret said bluntly. "And mistakes have consequences. But those consequences are theirs to bear, not yours." As Margaret walked away to check on other workers, Ruth stood frozen in her row, gripping her pruning shears until her knuckles turned white. She had known this confrontation was coming, but having it confirmed made everything feel suddenly precarious. How long before Bishop Mast escalated his pressure? How long before the entire Amish community turned against anyone who associated with her? "You okay?" Danny appeared beside her, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ruth debated whether to share her troubles, then decided these people had earned her honesty. "My bishop visited Margaret yesterday. He wants her to fire me." Danny's expression darkened. "Because you're Amish and working here? Because I'm defying his authority by working outside the community? Because I'm choosing independence over submission?" And Margaret told him to take a hike. Despite her worry, Ruth found herself smiling at Danny's blunt assessment. In more polite terms, yes, good for her, and good for you for standing up for yourself. Danny adjusted his baseball cap and looked thoughtfully across the vineyard. "You know, my grandmother was Italian. Came here when she was 16, didn't speak a word of English. Her family wanted her to stay in the Italian neighborhood, marry an Italian boy, never venture outside their little corner of the world." Ruth found herself drawn into the story, despite her anxiety. But Grandma Rose had other ideas. She learned English, got a job at the department store, married my Irish grandfather. Her family disowned her for 5 years. Wouldn't speak to her, wouldn't acknowledge her existence. What happened? Life happened. Her brothers needed work, and Grandpa knew people who were hiring. Her sister got sick, and Grandma Rose was the only one with money to help pay for medicine. Eventually they realized that the family they were punishing was the same family who would be there when they needed help. Ruth absorbed this story, wondering if her own community would ever reach the same realization. Did they ever forgive her? Better than that, they came to understand that she'd been right all along. By the time I was born, Grandma Rose was the one everyone came to for advice. They'd learned that sometimes the person who leaves is the one who grows strong enough to lift up everyone else. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of buggy wheels on gravel. Ruth looked up to see a familiar black buggy pulling into the vineyard's parking area, and her heart sank. Bishop Mast had returned, and this time he wasn't alone. 2 other men sat beside him, Deacon Miller and her own brother-in-law, Isaac. "Friend of yours?" Danny asked, noting Ruth's pale face. "My bishop," Ruth said quietly, "and my late husband's brother. Want me to stay close?" Ruth was touched by the offer of support from this young English man, who barely knew her. "Thank you, but this is something I need to face alone." She walked slowly toward the parking area, each step feeling like she was walking toward her own judgment. Isaac climbed down from the buggy first, and Ruth's heart clenched at the sight of him. He had Jacob's same dark hair and serious eyes, but where her husband had been gentle and understanding, Isaac had always been rigid in his adherence to community rules. "Ruth," Isaac said solemnly, not meeting her eyes, "you look different." Ruth glanced down at her work clothes, the jeans and long-sleeved shirt that had become as comfortable as her traditional dress. "I suppose I do." Bishop Mast and Deacon Miller approached with the slow, deliberate pace of men carrying weighty authority. The bishop's grey beard seemed longer and more severe than Ruth remembered, and his eyes held no warmth as they surveyed the vineyard around them. "Ruth Yoder," Bishop Mast said in his deep, measured voice, "we have come to bring you home." "I am working, Bishop," Ruth replied quietly. "This is my job." "This is your rebellion," Deacon Miller interjected. He was a thin, sharp-faced man who had never approved of Ruth's occasional questions during church discussions. "This is your pride leading you away from God's will." Isaac stepped forward, and for a moment Ruth hoped he might offer some family support. Instead, his words cut deeper than either of the other men's. "Jacob would be ashamed," he said quietly. "His wife dressed like an English woman, working alongside English men, abandoning the faith he died believing in." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, feeling as though Isaac had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. Jacob's memory was sacred to her, and to have it used as a weapon was almost unbearable. "Jacob would understand that I'm trying to save our children's home," she managed to say. "Jacob would understand that God's will must be accepted," Bishop Mast corrected sternly. "He would understand that a woman's place is in submission to her community's wisdom, not in defiance of it. My place is protecting my family." "Your family would be protected if you would accept the help being offered," Deacon Miller said. "The Beachy family has generous hearts. Your children would be well cared for." "Separately," Ruth said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "You want to break up my family and call it God's will." "We want to save your soul," Bishop Mast replied, "and the souls of your children, who are watching their mother choose the world over God." Ruth felt a familiar fury building in her chest, the same anger that had driven her to defy the bishop in her own kitchen. But before she could respond, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Margaret approaching, with David close behind her. "Gentlemen," Margaret said politely but firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is private property, and you're disrupting our workday." Bishop Mast turned his stern gaze on Margaret. "We are here to collect a member of our community who has lost her way." "You're here to harass one of my employers," David Morrison said bluntly, stepping up beside his wife, "and I won't tolerate harassment of my workers on my property." "This woman belongs to our community," Deacon Miller said, his voice rising. "She has responsibilities and obligations that supersede any employment arrangement." "This woman," David replied, his voice dangerously quiet, "is an adult who can make her own decisions about where she works and how she supports her family. And right now, she's doing an excellent job supporting her family through honest work." Isaac looked between Ruth and the Morrisons, his expression confused and angry. "Ruth, These people don't understand our ways. They don't understand what you're giving up, what you're losing. What am I losing, Isaac? Ruth asked, her voice breaking slightly. My community has already turned their backs on me. My bishop has already threatened me with shunning. My friends won't meet my eyes in church. What exactly am I losing that I haven't already lost? Your soul, Bishop Mast said simply. Your children's respect. Your husband's memory. Don't, Ruth said, her voice sharp with pain and anger. Don't you dare use Jacob's memory against me. He loved his children more than anything in this world, and he would move heaven and earth to keep them safe and together. What I'm doing here, working to save our home, to keep our family intact, that's exactly what Jacob would do if he were still alive. Jacob would submit to God's will, Isaac said stubbornly. Jacob would fight for his family, Ruth shot back. Just like I'm fighting for mine. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Ruth could see workers throughout the vineyard stopping their tasks to watch the confrontation, and she felt embarrassed to be the cause of such disruption. But she also felt something else, a clarity and certainty she hadn't experienced in months. Bishop, she said quietly, I've made my choice. I will continue working here until I've earned enough money to pay our debts and save our farm. I will continue raising my children according to the values Jacob and I share, and I will continue living my faith in the way I believe God intends, by taking care of the family he gave me. Then you choose shunning, Bishop Mast said with finality. You choose to cut yourself off from the only community you have ever known. You choose the world over God. I choose my family over your rules. Ruth replied, If that means shunning, then so be it. Bishop Mast turned to Isaac and Deacon Miller. We have delivered our message. Ruth Yoder has chosen her path. From this day forward she is no longer part of our community. No faithful member shall speak with her, trade with her, or acknowledge her existence. As the three men walked back toward their buggy, Isaac paused and looked back at Ruth. For a moment she thought she saw uncertainty in his eyes, maybe even regret. But then he shook his head and climbed into the buggy without another word. Ruth stood watching until the buggy disappeared down the road, feeling as though she was watching her entire past life drive away. The weight of what had just happened began to settle on her shoulders. She was truly alone now, cut off from everything she had ever known about community and belonging. Ruth, Margaret's voice was gentle as she approached. Are you all right? Ruth turned to face the people who had witnessed her final break with her past. Margaret and David Morrison, Danny, Carlos, Jake, Frank, and several other workers who had gathered during the confrontation. These English strangers who had become her co-workers, her supporters, what were they to her now? I don't know, Ruth said honestly. I think I just lost everything I thought I was. No, Carlos said firmly, stepping forward. You just found out who you really are. And who you really are is someone worth knowing. He's right, Danny added. What we just saw wasn't you losing yourself. That was you finding yourself. David Morrison, who rarely spoke unless necessary, cleared his throat. Ruth, I don't know much about religion or community rules, but I know character when I see it. And what you just showed, standing up for your family, choosing love over fear, that's the kind of character I respect. Ruth felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of something she couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or the strange joy that comes from finally standing in your own truth. Thank you, she whispered. All of you, I don't know what I would have done without family, Margaret finished softly. Because that's what we are now, Ruth. We're your chosen family. As the workers gradually returned to their tasks, Ruth stood in the morning sun, surrounded by people who had known her for less than a week, but who had shown her more loyalty and support than the community that had raised her. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The grapes still needed to be picked. The debt still needed to be paid. Her children still needed their mother to be strong. But for the first time since Jacob's death, Ruth Yoder knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. She belonged wherever there were people who valued courage over conformity, love over judgment, and family over rules. She picked up her pruning shears and got back to work. 2 weeks had passed since the shunning, and Ruth was surprised to discover that the world hadn't ended. If anything, her life had taken on a rhythm and purpose that felt more authentic than anything she had experienced in years. The work at the vineyard had become second nature, her body strong and capable in ways that amazed her. More importantly, the relationship she had built with her co-workers had deepened into something that felt remarkably like family. Morning sunshine, Danny called as Ruth approached the equipment shed on what had become a crisp October morning. The harvest was in its final weeks, and there was an urgency to the work that energized everyone. "Ready for the Cabernet section today? As ready as I'll ever be," Ruth replied, accepting the travel mug of coffee Carlos handed her. It had become their morning ritual. Carlos always arrived early and made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, sharing it with whoever needed an extra boost to start the day. "How are Sarah and Aaron adjusting?" Margaret asked, joining the group as they gathered their equipment. She had made it a point to check on Ruth's family situation regularly, understanding that the shunning affected more than just Ruth herself. "Better than I expected," Ruth said, though she could hear the worry in her own voice. "Sarah is handling it well. She's always been strong. But Aaron, it's harder for him. Some of the boys at school won't talk to him anymore. His best friend's parents won't let him come over to play. Kids can be cruel," Frank said with the wisdom of someone who had raised 4 children of his own. "But they're also resilient. Aaron will find his way just like his mama did." Ruth smiled gratefully at the older man, still amazed by how naturally these English people had accepted her family's struggles as their own. When word had spread through the small crew that Ruth's children were facing social isolation because of her work choices, the response had been immediate and practical. Jake had offered to help Aaron with his math homework. Margaret had suggested that Sarah might enjoy helping in the vineyard's gift shop on weekends for extra spending money. Carlos's wife, Maria, had sent over a casserole with a note saying she understood what it was like to be an outsider in a small community. "Actually," Margaret said, her voice carrying a note of excitement, "I have something that might help with Aaron. My nephew Tom is about his age, and he's been asking if he can come help with the harvest. Would Aaron be interested in earning a little money doing light work around the vineyard? Nothing too strenuous, just cleaning equipment, organizing supplies, helping with the tour groups." Ruth felt her eyes fill with tears. The kindness still caught her off guard sometimes, the way these people looked for ways to include and support her family, rather than reasons to exclude them. "I think he would love that," she said quietly. "He's been feeling pretty lost since everything changed." "Settled then," David Morrison said, appearing beside the group with his usual no-nonsense efficiency. "Tom will be here Saturday morning, and Aaron can start then if he wants. Fair wages for fair work." As they moved out to the Cabernet section, Ruth found herself walking alongside Jake, who had become something of a younger brother figure to her over the past few weeks. Despite their age difference, they had developed an easy friendship built on shared humor and mutual respect. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said, as they approached their assigned rows. "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Leaving your community, I mean. Starting over like this?" Ruth considered the question as she examined her first cluster of deep purple grapes. The Cabernet was different from the earlier varieties. The grapes were smaller and darker, with thicker skins that required more careful handling. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that my community chose rules over compassion. I regret that my children have to pay a price for my choices. But the choice itself? No, I don't regret that, even though it means losing everything you grew up with." Ruth paused in her picking, looking out across the vineyard where her co-workers were settling into their daily rhythm. In the distance, she could see Margaret talking with a group of tourists who had come for a morning wine tasting. David was examining vines with the intense focus he brought to everything. Carlos was patiently explaining grape selection to a new temporary worker. Danny was moving between rows, checking on everyone's progress with the easy leadership that made him such an effective foreman. "I thought I was losing everything," Ruth said, "but I think I was actually finding something I never knew I was missing. What's that? The freedom to be myself. The chance to discover what I'm actually capable of when I'm not trying to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. Jake grinned. Sounds pretty good when you put it that way. It is good, Ruth said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. Scary but good. Around mid-morning, Ruth noticed an unfamiliar car pulling into the vineyard's parking area. It was an older sedan, well-maintained, but clearly not the vehicle of a typical wine tourist. She watched curiously as a woman in her 70s climbed out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone nursing arthritic joints. The woman stood for a moment, looking around the vineyard with an expression Ruth couldn't quite read. There was something familiar about her posture, the way she carried herself, but Ruth couldn't place why she seemed recognizable. Excuse me, the woman called, approaching Ruth's section. I'm looking for someone who works here. Ruth Yoder. Ruth straightened, immediately wary. Over the past 2 weeks, she had learned to be cautious of unexpected visitors. The last thing she needed was another confrontation with someone from her former community. I'm Ruth Yoder, she said carefully. The woman moved closer, and Ruth could see that her eyes were bright blue and kind, set in a face that bore the lines of someone who had lived a long and interesting life. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a plain blue dress that was modest without being distinctively religious. My name is Eleanor Hoffman, the woman said, extending her hand. I believe you knew my daughter. Ruth shook the offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of work. I'm sorry, but I don't think I know any Hoffmans. Eleanor smiled, and suddenly Ruth felt a jolt of recognition. That smile, the shape of the eyes, something about the way the woman tilted her head. You knew her as Rebecca Morrison, Eleanor said quietly. She was my daughter before she married David. Ruth's mouth fell open. Rebecca Morrison. But, that's impossible. David's first wife died 20 years ago. Margaret told you the truth. As far as she knows it, Eleanor said gently. Rebecca did die 20 years ago. But before she died, she did something that no one in David's family ever knew about. Something I've kept secret until now. Ruth felt the world shifting beneath her feet, the way it had when Jacob collapsed in the cornfield, the way it had when the medical bills arrived, the way it had when Bishop Mast pronounced her shunning. But this felt different, not like destruction, but like the moment before a revelation that would change everything. I don't understand, Ruth said. Eleanor looked around at the bustling vineyard, at the workers moving through the rows, at the buildings David and Rebecca had planned together so many years ago. Before Rebecca died, she made me promise something, Eleanor continued. She made me promise that if this place ever needed help, if David ever needed help, I would find a way to provide it. She made me promise to watch over the vineyard she would never see completed. But how does that involve me? Eleanor's smile was sad, and no, because, dear Ruth, I've been watching this vineyard for 20 years. I've seen David work himself to exhaustion, trying to build the dream he shared with Rebecca. I've seen Margaret come into his life and help him heal. And recently I've heard about a brave Amish woman who defied her entire community to save her family farm. Ruth stared at the older woman, trying to process what she was hearing. You see, Eleanor continued, I'm not just Eleanor Hoffman. I'm also the primary beneficiary of my late husband's estate. My husband Henry owned Hoffman Industries, agricultural equipment manufacturing. When he died 5 years ago, I inherited more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I've been looking for ways to honor both Henry's memory and the promise I made to Rebecca. Ruth felt like she was in a dream. I still don't understand what this has to do with me. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a bank draft, Ruth, made out to you for $25,000. Ruth staggered backward as if she'd been struck. What? No, I can't. I don't understand. Rebecca made me promise to help this vineyard however I could. Eleanor explained patiently. For 20 years, I've been making anonymous donations for equipment, emergency repairs, expansion costs. David and Margaret have never known where the money came from. They think it's from some agricultural development grant. Ruth stared at the bank draft, the numbers swimming before her eyes. $25,000. More than enough to pay off Jacob's medical debt with money left over. But why me, she whispered. You don't even know me. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Because, dear girl, watching you work these past few weeks, seeing your courage and determination, your willingness to sacrifice everything for your family, you remind me of Rebecca. She had that same fierce love for the people she cared about, that same strength in the face of impossible odds. I can't take this, Ruth said, though her hands were shaking as she held the bank draft. It's too much. I haven't earned it. Haven't earned it? Eleanor laughed, but it was a sound full of warmth rather than mockery. Child, you've worked harder in the past month than most people work in a year. You've shown courage that most people never find. You've put your family's welfare above your own comfort and safety. If that doesn't earn help when it's available, then what does? Ruth looked around the vineyard, seeing her co-workers pretending not to watch while obviously curious about the conversation. She saw Margaret approaching from the tasting room, concern evident on her face. She saw David working methodically through his section, unaware that his late wife's mother was standing in his vineyard, finally ready to reveal a secret she'd kept for 20 years. Does David know? Ruth asked. Does he know you're Rebecca's mother? Eleanor shook her head. Rebecca and I were estranged when she died. It's a long, sad story about pride and stubbornness and misunderstandings that seemed important at the time. I never got the chance to reconcile with her before the cancer took her. David knew she had family, but we never met. After she died, I respected his grief and stayed away. Then why reveal yourself now? Because I'm 76 years old, and I've spent 20 years regretting the relationship I never got to repair with my daughter. I don't want to spend whatever years I have left regretting the help I never gave when it was desperately needed. Margaret had reached them now, her face curious and concerned. Ruth, is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Eleanor turned to Margaret with that familiar smile that Ruth now realized she had seen in old photographs of Rebecca Morrison. Not a ghost, Eleanor said gently, just Seven who should have introduced herself a long time ago. Margaret Morrison? I'm Eleanor Hoffman. I was Rebecca's mother. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret's face went through a series of emotions, surprise, confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of wonder. Rebecca's mother, Margaret said slowly. But David said you and Rebecca weren't in contact when she died. We weren't, Eleanor confirmed. But that doesn't mean I stopped caring about the life she was trying to build. The life you helped David complete. Margaret glanced at Ruth, who was still staring at the bank draft in her hands. I'm sorry, I don't understand what's happening here. What's happening, Eleanor said, is that I'm finally keeping a promise I made to my daughter 20 years ago. A promise to help this vineyard and the people who work it when help is needed. She gestured toward Ruth. This remarkable woman has been working herself to exhaustion to save her family's farm. She's shown the kind of courage and determination that Rebecca would have admired. And I'm in a position to help. Margaret looked at the bank draft in Ruth's hands, and her eyes widened. Mrs. Hoffman, this is incredibly generous, but we can't ask you to. You're not asking, Eleanor interrupted firmly. I'm offering. More than that, I'm insisting. Rebecca made me promise to watch over this place and the people who belong to it. As far as I'm concerned, Ruth belongs here now. Ruth felt tears streaming down her face as the full impact of Eleanor's gift began to sink in. Not just the money, though that was life-changing enough, but the acceptance, the recognition that she belonged somewhere, the knowledge that someone she barely knew had seen her worth and chosen to act on it. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say you'll accept it, Eleanor replied. Say you'll use it to save your farm and give your children the security they deserve. Say you'll let an old woman finally do something right." Ruth looked around at the faces surrounding her. Margaret's wonder and joy, the curious but supportive expressions of her co-workers who had drifted closer during the conversation, and Eleanor's hopeful, determined face. "I'll accept it," Ruth said, her voice stronger now, "and I'll use it to save my farm. And I'll never forget the kindness that made it possible." Eleanor stepped forward and pulled Ruth into a fierce hug. "Rebecca would be so proud," she whispered, "of you, of this place, of the family that's grown up around her dream." As word of what had happened spread through the vineyard, Ruth found herself surrounded by her chosen family, all of them celebrating her good fortune as if it were their own. Danny was grinning so widely, his face might split. Carlos was wiping away tears without shame. Jake was whooping with joy. Frank was shaking his head in amazement at the turn of events. But it was Margaret who put the moment into perspective. "You know what this means," she said, her voice full of emotion. "What?" Ruth asked. "It means you're free. Truly free. Free to choose your life without desperation, driving your decisions. Free to be whoever you want to be." Ruth looked out across the vineyard that had become her salvation, surrounded by people who had become her family, holding a bank draft that represented not just financial security, but the profound kindness of strangers who had chosen to see her worth. For the first time since Jacob's death, Ruth Yoder felt like she could breathe fully. The future, which had seemed so frightening and uncertain just weeks ago, now stretched before her, full of possibility. And the most shocking thing of all, she had found it not by following the rules she had been taught, but by having the courage to write new ones. 6 months later, Ruth stood in her kitchen, watching through the window as Aaron and Tom Morrison worked together to repair the fence that had been sagging since before Jacob's death. The boys had become inseparable friends, their laughter drifting across the farmyard as they argued good-naturedly about the best way to set a fence post. The medical bills were gone, paid in full with Eleanor's generous gift and Ruth's harvest earnings. The farm was secure, the mortgage current, and for the first time in over a year, Ruth could sleep through the night without the weight of impending disaster pressing on her chest. But more than the financial security, it was the transformation in her children that filled Ruth's heart with gratitude. Sarah had blossomed working part-time at the vineyard's gift shop, her natural warmth and intelligence making her a favorite with tourists. She had even started talking about maybe going to college someday, something that would have been unthinkable in their old life. "Mama," Sarah called from the porch, "Eleanor's buggy is coming up the lane." Ruth smiled at her daughter's casual use of the word buggy to describe Eleanor's sedan. The older woman had become a fixture in their lives, visiting several times a week and gradually becoming the grandmother figure that Sarah and Aaron had never known. Eleanor climbed out of her car with the careful movements of someone whose arthritis was acting up, but her smile was as bright as ever. She had changed remarkably over the past months, the loneliness that had shadowed her eyes gradually replaced by the joy of finally belonging somewhere. "How are my favorite people today?" Eleanor called, accepting Sarah's help up the porch steps. "Happy," Ruth said simply, and realized it was completely true. They settled around the kitchen table, the same table where Ruth had once sat staring at impossible bills and contemplating the destruction of everything she held dear. Now it was set for afternoon tea, with Sarah's fresh-baked cookies and the comfortable conversation of people who had chosen to become family. "I have something to tell you all," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling with barely contained excitement. "David and Margaret have agreed to let me buy the property adjacent to the vineyard. I'm going to build a small house there. You're moving here permanently?" Sarah asked, delighted. "This is where my family is now," Eleanor said simply, reaching over to squeeze Ruth's hand. "Where else would I want to be?" Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. The concept of chosen family had been foreign to her just months ago, but now it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. These people, Eleanor, Margaret, David, Danny, Carlos, Jake, Frank, and all the others, had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. They had supported her when her own community had abandoned her. "There's something else," Eleanor continued. "I've been talking with Margaret about starting a program at the vineyard. a kind of sanctuary for people who need a fresh start. People who've lost their way, or been cast out, or just need a chance to discover what they're capable of. Ruth understood immediately. People like me, people exactly like you, strong, determined people who just need someone to believe in them long enough for them to believe in themselves. The sound of a buggy, a real buggy this time, coming up the lane made them all turn toward the window. Ruth's heart clenched as she recognized the familiar black buggy and the man driving it. "Isaac, I should go," Eleanor said, reading the tension in Ruth's face. "No," Ruth said firmly. "Stay. Your family. This is your home too." Isaac climbed down from the buggy slowly, his movements uncertain in a way that was unlike the confident man who had stood in judgment of Ruth months earlier. He removed his hat as he approached the porch, and Ruth could see that his face was thinner, his eyes troubled. "Ruth," he said quietly, May I speak with you?" Ruth looked at her chosen family gathered around the table, drawing strength from their presence. "Of course. Would you like to come inside?" Isaac glanced through the window at the unfamiliar faces, particularly Eleanor, whose plain dress and simple appearance clearly confused him. "Perhaps we could walk." They strolled toward the barn where Jacob had spent so many peaceful hours tending to equipment and planning for seasons to come. Isaac was quiet for several minutes, seemingly struggling with whatever had brought him here. "The community is troubled," he said finally. "I'm sorry to hear that. 3 families have left since you were shunned. The Millers moved to Ohio to be closer to family. The Yoder cousins, no relation to you, bought land in Pennsylvania, and Samuel Beachy took his family to Indiana." Ruth absorbed this news quiet. The loss of families was serious business in a small Amish community, representing not just fewer hands for work, but a weakening of the social fabric that held everything together. "People are asking questions," Isaac continued, "about your debts being paid, about how you managed to save the farm, about whether the community was right to turn you away in your time of need. And what answers are they getting?" Isaac stopped walking and turned to face her. "The truth, that a woman we cast out for choosing her family over our rules succeeded through her own strength and the kindness of strangers. That the English world we taught you to fear showed you more compassion than your own people." Ruth could hear the pain in her brother-in-law's voice, and despite everything that had passed between them, her heart softened. Isaac had lost his brother just as she had lost her husband. His grief and confusion had been channeled into rigid adherence to rules, just as hers had been channeled into fierce protection of her children. "What do you want from me, Isaac?" "I want to apologize," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "for using Jacob's memory against you, for abandoning you when you needed support, for being so afraid of change that I couldn't see the strength it took to make the choices you made." Ruth felt tears on her cheeks. "Isaac, and I want to ask if there's any way, if there's any possibility." He struggled with the words. "The bishop is talking about asking you to return, about acknowledging that perhaps the community was wrong." Ruth looked back toward the house where her chosen family waited, then across the fields where her children played with friends who accepted them without condition, then at the vineyard visible in the distance where she had discovered her own strength and worth. "I am home, Isaac," she said gently. "This is where I belong now. But your faith, your heritage, my faith is stronger now than it ever was," Ruth interrupted quietly. "I learned that faith isn't about following rules blindly. It's about having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. I learned that God's love isn't limited to one community or one way of living." Isaac's shoulders slumped. "So you won't come back?" "I can't come back to something I've outgrown," Ruth said. "But Isaac, that doesn't mean I don't love you. You're still family. Jacob's family. If you ever need anything, if you ever want to visit, you're welcome here." They walked back toward the house in companionable silence, and Ruth felt a sense of completion, as if the last loose thread in her new life had finally been tied off. As Isaac prepared to leave, he paused beside his buggy. "Ruth, I want you to know, Jacob would be proud of you, proud of your courage, proud of how you've raised the children, proud of the woman you've become." "Thank you," Ruth whispered. "That means everything to me." After Isaac left, Ruth returned to the kitchen, where her family waited. Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Sarah was holding Tom's hand across the table, and Aaron was looking at his mother with something like awe. "Are you sad, Mama?" Aaron asked. "About not going back?" Ruth sat down at the table and looked around at these faces that had become her world. Eleanor, who had seen her worth and acted on it. Sarah, who had supported her mother's impossible choices without question. Aaron, who had learned to be brave by watching his mother's courage. "No, sweet boy," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I'm not sad. I'm grateful. Grateful for this table, this home, this family we've built together. Grateful for the chance to discover who I really am." "Who are you, Mama?" Sarah asked with the wisdom of someone who had watched her mother transform. Ruth smiled, thinking of the terrified woman who had walked to the vineyard 6 months ago, desperate and alone. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had outgrown, like clothes that no longer fit. "I'm someone who learned that the most important thing isn't where you come from," she said. "It's who you choose to become, and who you choose to love." As the evening settled around them and the Ohio hills turned gold in the setting sun, Ruth Yoder, vineyard worker, devoted mother, beloved friend, sat surrounded by the family she had chosen, and who had chosen her in return. The woman who had once feared losing everything had instead found something she never knew she was missing, the freedom to be exactly who she was meant to be. And in the distance, the grapevines that had first offered her sanctuary swayed gently in the evening breeze, heavy with the promise of next year's harvest.